Hello, everybody. Thank you for the lovely lunch. So we're thinking of Kindertransport. Can you read that? That was an advert in the Manchester Guardian. Can you imagine how desperate a parent would have to be to place an advert? Now look at the top one. Good family sought for pretty, well-educated 8-year-old girl. People have got to be pretty desperate to be thinking of sending their much-loved children abroad. The next one, a whole family in great despair, appealing for somebody to take them in. Well, our interest in this was really sparked by my wife finding this letter, and I know I put 2 photocopies of it in my briefcase before I left home so I could pass one round each side of the room, but a miracle has happened and they've disappeared. It's really a very ordinary letter. It's a lady in, well, can you read it? Zabra, writing to say thank you to an unknown lady in this country. Thank you for taking my children in. You'll find the clothes we packed in a great hurry. You'll find that some of them are too big for them, but they'll grow into them. Probably they'll tell you they don't eat vegetables, but it's a lie. Make sure they eat their greens. It's a very ordinary letter, but very poignant, of course, because the lady in Zabra had given her children up. She never saw them again. She died in the gas chamber. Because Zabra by then was in what was called the Protectorate. It was under German rule. And her children were saved by what was known as Kindertransport. And Zabra, well, where is it? There it is. It's now in Czech Republic. In those days, Czech Republic and Slovakia were one country, Czechoslovakia. And if you look at what's around them, well, Germany to the north and the west, Austria had really become part of Germany by then, and Poland was about to be invaded by the Germans. The north of Czechoslovakia had already been taken over by the Germans. There was no way out if you were Jewish, and the Germans were determined to kill the Jews. So Kindertransport came into being. Simply means children's transport. It went on for about 9 months, leading up to World War II. There was a window of opportunity for 9 months to get children out. And the United Kingdom, over that time, took in 10,000 Jewish children from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Danzig. What country is Danzig in? No, I didn't know either. I looked.
Poland.
Yes, it's now in Poland. It was, in fact, a separate territory in those days. Now we call it Gdansk, and it is now part of Poland. And Britain was the only country in the world that was prepared to accept Jews. Other countries closed their borders, but the British government said, well, they would accept Jewish children up to the age of 17. And they didn't put a limit on the number, though they did apply some limitations. So Jewish families in Europe, in the German-occupied areas, some got the opportunity to get their children out. A heartbreaking decision to have to make. British government waived the requirement to have visa and passport, provided somebody put up the money. It was supposed to be a temporary thing after the emergency was over. They'd return to their families. So they had to pay the British government £50 to pay for their return fare when eventually they returned home. Doesn't sound very much to us, £50, but in spending terms today, we're talking about £3,000 or more. Quite a lot of money if you're sending 3 or 4 children, then £9,000 or £12,000, and there had to be foster families already arranged to take the children in, and they hadn't to be aged over 17. But that was very generous compared, say, with America, which didn't waive the requirement for visas and passports. In fact, a bill was placed before the Senate to do the same as Britain had done, but it was voted down, and they went to great lengths to try and keep the Jews out of America at that time, and every other country in the world did the same. Now, this picture will represent a particular night that became infamous. We call it Kristallnacht, when so many windows were broken and places torched, synagogues and Jewish homes and Jewish businesses. November 1938, 5 days later, the Prime Minister in this country was lobbied by groups saying, please at least let Jewish children into Britain. Another 5 days later, the Home Secretary was also lobbied, and people were saying, we will provide homes for them. Well, at that time, could the government possibly know that parents would let their children come unaccompanied? Well, the government did actually know that. In a moment, we'll talk about how they knew that parents, Jewish parents in Europe, would let their children come unaccompanied. So let me see, the following day, after the Home Secretary was lobbied, he put a bill before Parliament, and it was rushed through and passed that day to allow unaccompanied children to come to the UK without passports or visas, subject to those conditions we've talked about. And just 10 days later, the first trainload of children left Berlin with 200 Jewish children. The following day, they arrived in this country and were placed with foster homes. 8 days later, a train with 600 children came from Vienna. And that's quite a remarkable achievement. It was a most amazing woman called Mrs. Weissmuller-Meyer, who was a Dutch lady. She'd read about what was happening to the Jews in Austria, and she went to find out. And she was horrified by what she saw, and she demanded to see the commandant, the German commandant, who was dealing with the Jews, and it was no less a person than Adolf Eichmann, who eventually commanded the Auschwitz camp. And she said, well, you must let the children go. The British government has said they'll accept them. And he said, yes, the children can go. If you can take them, you can take up to 600 children, provided you do so at your own expense, and provided you do it by the end of this week. Well, there's no possibility, he thought, of her arranging to get 600 children out of Austria by the end of that week. But by the grace of God, it happened. So at first it was mainly from Austria and Germany that the children's transport was bringing the Jewish children. It was actually in February 1939 that the British government imposed the £50 charge, Stanley Baldwin, the former Prime Minister, set up a fund to try and raise the money by public subscription, and the Christadelphians contributed £1,250. Do your sums, that's enough to pay for 25 children. In modern terms, 25 children at £3,000 each, that's £75,000, isn't it? There's quite a lot of money to raise in a very short time. So it was quite an achievement for a small community like the Christadelphians, but it didn't end there. And from Poland there were train loads in February and August. In March 1939, the first successful train from Prague and the last successful train load from Prague. There have been 9 trains in that time, in 2nd of August, with the children on board. In 1940, Germany finally invaded Holland. 10th of May, 14th of May, Mrs. Weissmuller-Meyer managed to get 74 children, Jewish children, onto a ship out of Holland and over to this country. She could have come herself, but she chose to stay behind, and she continued to smuggle during the war, during the German occupation, right up to 1943. She managed to smuggle 100 children across Europe and over the border into Spain, which was nominally at least a neutral country. Quite an astonishing woman. Now, how's your Greek? Can you read it? Remember, an upside down Y is really the letter lambda, which sounds L. So this reads holocaustos, right? So you know what it is. Holos meaning whole, kaustos meaning burned, so holy burnt. So a holocaust is a burnt offering, but it's come nowadays to mean the destruction of the Jews by the Germans in places like this, Auschwitz. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, we read of Moses at the end of his life telling the people of Israel, God is bringing you to the promised land. You're about to enter it. You have promised to be faithful to God, and he has promised you that if you will be faithful and won't worship other gods, then he will bless you. He will protect you in this land. He will make sure the harvest never fails. You will live. You'll never be defeated by your enemies so long as you're faithful to God. There was a chapter of the blessings that would come upon them if they were faithful. And then he said, but if you're unfaithful, then God will curse you. If you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, keep his commandments, these curses shall come upon you. There's a trend of people, when they ran out of coaches, railway passenger coaches, to take them to the camps, they put them in cattle wagons. The Lord will scatter you among all peoples. You'll serve other gods. And so crushed into the cattle wagons at gunpoint. Among these nations you'll find no respite. There will be no resting place for your foot. I find this picture terribly poignant. This is at the other end when they're getting off, and the men are separated off. They're to go to work so long as they're strong enough, and the women and children, though they don't realize it, I don't think they face a more uncertain future. The poignant thing, can you see there's a lady at the end of the queue? What do you do when somebody points a camera at you? My natural reaction, I was brought up, is somebody puts a camera, I smile. There's a lady at the back of the queue is smiling for the camera, and really they're heading toward their death. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. Night and day you shall be in dread. There's the men, so long as they were strong enough they could work. Can you see at the front of this group, there's one man here, they stand up, but if he says I'm too sick to work, then he'll be killed immediately. So on either side of him, perhaps it's his sons, perhaps it's his brothers, they're trying to stand him up. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. At evening you shall say, if only it were morning. Terrible situation. And it came to pass, because of old, Israel broke their covenant with God. They were unfaithful. They did worship other gods. God withdrew his protection, and those terrible things that were prophesied actually came true. The happier side of it was that there were people willing to try to help, and particularly to try to save the children. God had spoken to the father of the Jews, Abraham. He was originally called Abram. Go from your country and your kindred to the land that I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I'll bless those who bless you, and curse him that curseth you. Who cursed, dishonored Israel? Well, Hitler did, and we know what happened to Hitler. God kept his word. I will curse those who dishonor you, said God. But he also said, I'll bless those who bless you. And that, I suppose, is why people like the Christadelphians said, we must do what we can to help, to bless the descendants of Abraham. So here's what one of these survivors wrote. This was a teenage girl. In April 1939, I was put on the Kindertransport and sent to England, actually sent to Whittingham Castle on Lord Balfour's estate in Scotland. Jewish and non-Jewish families took in the younger children, but I was already 15. Nobody wanted a 15-year-old. Will you take in a foster child for an unknown period of time? Oh yeah, we'll do, will we? So would you like a pretty little 8-year-old, or do you want to take a ball-shaved 15, 16, 17-year-old? It was very difficult to place the teenagers. So Lord Balfour's family, you remember he of the Balfour Declaration, he was a keen supporter of the Jews, and his family opened their castle and made it a hostel for a great many Jewish teenagers. Proverbs chapter 24. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, behold, we didn't know this. We didn't know this problem was going on in Europe. We didn't help because we knew not. If you say, behold, we didn't know, doesn't he who weighs the heart perceive it? Doesn't he who keeps watch over your soul know it? So the Old Testament told us to help. Quite a number of people helped. One of the heroes of the story is this man, Israel, who was a German Jew, and he got in contact with the British government and told them in advance what was going on. He told them in advance of Kristallnacht that this was planned. They were just waiting for an excuse to put it into action. He actually contacted the British government through Britain's chief spy in Germany, man called Frank Foley. He's said, look, this is really going to happen. You've got to do something to help. And why don't you agree to take the children? And the British government said, the children will never come. Parents won't let them go. So Wilfred Israel arranged for parties, mostly Quakers from this country, to go to Germany and meet the families, the Jewish families, and say, look, if it comes to this, will you let your children go? And they said, yes, we will. So he reported back through Frank Foley, so that when all this started to happen, the British government already had an assurance that the families would let the children come. Sadly, he didn't survive the war, Wilfred Israel. His contact was this man, Frank Foley, who I think of as an unsung hero. He was actually an academic, a linguist. He had looked forward to a career in the university, but in the First World War he was drafted into the Secret Service because he had language skills, and between the wars he became the head of station in Berlin, the head of the British intelligence service there. So he wasn't listed in the embassy in the information to the German government, oh yes, this is our chief spy. They actually gave him a job as a passport officer, which wasn't even a diplomatic post. He didn't have diplomatic immunity. But he used that cover story as a passport officer. He used it to bend the rules and grant visas, not to children, they didn't need visas, but to grown-up Jews. He issued visas to 10,000 German Jews and enabled them to escape to this country. He actually went into the internment camps and got them out. And if they didn't have passports, then he forged them for them. And he hid the Jews in his own home. Quite a remarkable man. And after the war, he was recognized by the Israeli government. Then there's Nicholas Winton, who is rather better known because he survived long enough to be still alive when these stories were emerging. He was from a German Jewish family, though he was born in this country. He was a stockbroker. He had great organizational ability, and in 1938 a friend of his phoned him from Prague. Nicholas, there's a terrible situation, we need you to come and help. So he cancelled his holiday and went to Prague and set up an organization to get the children out. The British government said they would accept them. The Germans at that time were saying, yes, we'll let them go, but it needed somebody to organize them. Organize trains at that end to get them here, and organize foster homes here to accept them. So he actually got his mother to be arranging for foster homes in the UK. And Nicholas Winton, he was in his 20s, he was a young man at the time, but he fired off letters here, there and everywhere asking for support to politicians. He arranged trains to bring the children from Prague to London, and they had to pass through the Netherlands because from Prague, they got across Germany, and the Germans said yes, they'd let them pass, but they wouldn't let them go through German ports. They wanted to keep German ports free for the military, so they would have to go through some other country. Basically, it had to be Holland. So he arranged trains to go through Holland to the ports to get on ships to bring them to this country. But the Dutch, like every other country, had closed its borders to the Jews. They wouldn't let Jews in. And the first train he sent was stopped at the border and turned back and sent into Germany. So the very young Nicholas Winton went and sorted it out and arranged for gave an undertaking that these Jewish children were not going to stay in Holland, they were only passing through, and he persuaded the Dutch government to change their policy so that their trains were allowed to pass through Holland, and in all 9 trains successfully made the journey from Prague to Rotterdam, and nearly 700 children were saved. And in 1988, his wife found all the tags and things. She knew nothing of what he'd done in the attic, and said, "What are these, Nick?" And he told her, and she said, "Well, we should pass them back to these children." He said, "I don't know where they are." So he ended up, she arranged for the BBC to make an announcement. Did you see this programme? That's Life, wasn't it? With, what's the woman's name? Esther Ranson, yeah. She was making an announcement, and Nicholas Winton had been invited to be in the studio audience when the BBC would make this announcement. If anybody was on one of those trains, then if they contact Nicholas Winton, he'll give them the paperwork relating to them. And he was very surprised indeed when they turned the camera around, sitting on the front row, minding his own business. Suddenly he was on live on nationwide television, and he was told that the lady sitting next to him, actually she was one of the children, one of the survivors. And it turned out that the entire studio audience was made up of survivors who'd survived through the trains he'd arranged. So there was then a clamour to say that he should be honoured, and he was knighted in 2003 and received various other honours. He always said it was just because that he'd lived so long, all the others who'd helped had now died. And here's another of the heroes, and who is this? Maggie's grandfather, Brother Alan Overton, who was a shopkeeper in Rugby, but a Christadelphian with a very keen interest in Israel, Palestine, the affairs of the Jews. In fact, he made it his business to go to London every time Parliament was going to be debating the Jewish people and the land of Palestine, and he used to queue up and get into the strangers' gallery to listen to the debates. He was very keenly interested because he'd been reading his Bible, and the Bible said that the Jews would return to Palestine. It would become their homeland again. Everybody else said impossible. The Bible said it would happen, so Alan Overton believed that it would happen. And immediately after Kristallnacht, he set up a Christadelphian committee to raise money to fund these £50 pledges for getting the refugees to this country. He put an article in the Christadelphian magazine appealing for others to help. At first there wasn't very much response, but eventually others helped, including this lady, our sister Gladys Finch, and she wrote about her experiences. This is what she wrote. You remember that early in the war, or before the war, they were evacuating children from the great cities like London and Birmingham and Glasgow out into the country because they expected bombing, and they wanted at least to save the children. Children in this country were evacuated to the country. And Sister Finch wrote, "Many of us have been touched recently by the sight of child evacuees fleeing from our great cities to the more remote parts of the country. But have you ever seen that far more tragic spectacle, a transport of Jewish refugees arriving from the continent? Imagine yourself, therefore, in the gymnasium at Liverpool Street Station. 2 by 2, the children file into the space behind the ropes. Heavy boots laden with bundles, the older ones carrying or leading the toddlers who slept on their knees. Here's a bedraggled baby in tears, pulling at the luggage label tied round her neck. Drooping with weariness, sits down, leans her curly head against a suitcase. Stoop down and touch the curls and hear a baby voice repeat sleepily the only English word she knows. How are you? Susanna. My name is Susanna. Please. Thank you. Before they left, they were told you must be very polite and you must learn to speak English. And they've been taught a few English words. Just as when we go on holiday, we learn to say thank you to the waiter, or where is the toilet, or the things you need to know when you're abroad. In the gallery, tragic faces stared down, haggard, inured to suffering and disappointment. Refugee parents who escaped from Germany hoped their children might make it too. One man pushes through the barrier, hands round a little boy. Papa, cries the boy. A single happy ending among so much tragedy. Well, that lady was able to help because she had a car. And Alan Overton, having raised the money for the pledges and persuaded Christadelphians around Britain to take children in, he got to get them from Liverpool Street Station to the homes that were taking them. So Gladys Finch was one of the people who helped, and he himself was travelling frequently down to London to meet the trains and to get the children to the homes he arranged. Often they stayed at his home overnight until they could be moved on to the foster home that had been arranged for them. And all around the country, the Christadelphian community was now rallying to help, but with this problem that most families, given the choice, they're taking a little girl or perhaps a little boy, but teenage boys were a great no-no. So they had to find another solution, but Brother Alan didn't let anything stand in his way. He persuaded his committee to open a hostel in Rugby, and so Little Thorn Lodge was opened. It could house 9 boys, which wasn't enough. So with help from Christadelphians in Birmingham, Coventry, they raised the funds nationally to open a bigger hostel. They called it Elpis Lodge in Edgbaston in Birmingham, and that housed a rather greater number. The Christadelphians had to agree that they wouldn't attempt to convert the Jewish children they fostered, but some nevertheless did come to accept the Christadelphian faith. There's Brother Alan with a group of the boys in his hostel in Rugby. You may be familiar with this Christadelphian book, published not by the office but by Christadelphian Sunday School Union. Extraordinary stories of ordinary people. Brother Frank Birch there from Sheffield. There's my niece, Anna Whitaker. But we're looking in particular at Sister Inga Beecham, who's now at Sutton Coldfield Ecclesia, though she lives in Olivet. There she was at a garden party a couple of years ago. And her story really starts with Kristallnacht. The Nazis had come to power in 1933 and immediately started depriving Jews of freedom of movement or the right to be educated or to be in business. Men were arrested and deported to concentration camps, And then in 1938 came Kristallnacht. Businesses, synagogues, homes vandalized, looted and burnt. And this is what Sister Inga writes in that little book. I was a child of 10 on the November night that later became known as Kristallnacht. My parents were in business. They owned a department store in Germany. However, they were Jewish. They went to the synagogue. So my father was arrested on a trumped-up charge, and my mother, my 7-year-old sister, and I moved to Berlin. They thought they'd be safer there. But Kindertransport was happening. Britain had opened its borders to the children. So she writes, many Jewish children were able to come to Britain. My sister and I travelled to Rotterdam, then to Birmingham, where there were Christadelphians waiting. My sister went to live with a family called the Hovards, a Christadelphian family in Birmingham. I went to stay with the Day family, who already had 5 daughters, quite a bit older than me. Dad Day bought me a dictionary, which I treasured. I wrote to my mother in Berlin. She wrote back, if Christadelphians had been good enough to take us in, their beliefs must be good enough too. My father died in custody. My mother died in Auschwitz. We went to Birmingham Central meeting, and I was baptized in 1947 when I was 18, says Inga. That means she was 9 in 1938 when she escaped. When Dad Day died, I went to live with Sister Humperson, and Mary Isaacs, another refugee. She was baptized in 1950. Some of you may remember Mary was adopted by the Humperson. She became Mary Humperson. She actually got married, became Mary Camplin. Mary Camplin when I knew her, but she died. But then there's a mother with a letter. So this letter, I say our interest in it, is signed Hermine Borger. And it's, as I said, from a lady in Czech Republic, as we now call it, saying, thank you for taking my children in. And the family who took them in had 2 children of their own. So they took a boy and a girl because they had a boy and a girl of their own. And their own girl grew up, became an old lady, and died in Olivet Christadelphian care home in Birmingham a few years ago. My wife had helped look after her, and she was her executor, or executrix, as we say, if we're properly educated and come from Scotland. And she found this letter, which was from the refugee's mother to Sister Hazel's mother. And Jill actually knew those refugees because Hazel hadn't in recent years. She was still in touch with them, but she couldn't write anymore. She was quite disabled. So Jill used to write her letters to her, for her at her dictation, and post them off to her. And the 2 refugees were now in, well, the boy was now in Australia and the girl was in Israel. So Jill thought, well, the girl never replied to any letter, but the boy always did. He was an old man of 85 by this time. Jill thought, goodness, here's a letter from his mother 70 years ago. So she sent it to him, and he was deeply moved by that. And at the time, in our ecclesia, we had an appeal. Have you got any news to put on our website? So I wrote a paragraph saying how Jill had found this letter and sent it to the son of the lady who'd written it. He'd received a letter from his mother written 70 years earlier. And then in America, a young Christadelphian called Jason Hensley was he's a teacher, wondering what he should teach his children as a project, and he read a little bit about Kindertransport, and wondered if the Christadelphians had been involved in any way. So he Googled Christadelphians Kindertransport, and it took him to the website of our ecclesia, and he eventually got in touch. And Jill was able to tell him how to get in touch with other people who had been involved. And coincidentally, at the same time, a Christadelphian in London had been looking at his dad's old 8mm cine films, home movies, and he'd found this movie called Karel and Edith from Moravia. I thought, who on earth are they? Who are Karel and Edith from Moravia? Well, that's Karel and that's Edith. And he looked at the film, and there's Moravia. It's now part of Czechoslovakia, and their city was 200 kilometers from Prague. And he recognized his cousin, Hazel Fawcett, who's the old lady who just died. She'd been a girl then. And he thought, well, perhaps these were Jewish refugees. He saw that the Philadelphian in California was trying to find out. He thought he might have some information about them. So he sent him an email and said, I've got this cine film of two people from Moravia called Karel and Edith. Do you have any information on them? And the brother in California said, yes. Sister Jill MacDonald in Birmingham has just put me in touch with them, and I spoke on the phone yesterday to Karel. So, Brother Foster said, give me his address, I'll send him the film. And somehow this story came to the attention of the BBC. They thought it was a rather nice little story, so they made a radio program about it. It's still available, actually, on playback. You can listen to it. It runs for 24 minutes. And there's Edith now. That's Brother Simon Foster. Edith, she lives in Israel. And there's Karel now. At his granddaughter's wedding. So he's the man who received a letter from his mother 70 years after she died. Winton, well, he lived to 105. The first of his trains left Prague the last of his trains, left Prague in 1939, 2nd of August, and that's the one that these two were on, Karel and Edith. He arranged another train, but it was intercepted by the Germans. Their uncle, who arranged for them to be on it, well, he died, along with their parents. That last train from September 1939, 250 children were on it, ready to go, but only 2 of them survived the war. To commemorate that, after 70 years in 1909, the train did successfully go from Prague and to Liverpool Street Station, and Nicholas Winton, no longer in his 20s but now 100 years old, was there to greet the trainload of survivors who made that journey again. They put up a statue to him in Prague Station, and a similar statue at Liverpool Street Station with a glass suitcase with some of the actual artifacts they brought with them. It's not there anymore, it's now in the London Museum behind St Paul's Cathedral. Lots of books about this. That's a very interesting book by Deborah Hodge, the story of Kindertransport, called Rescuing the Children. Well, that one, Survivors, is particularly about the Midlands of England, it's written by a Jewish lady, and it's about survivors of the Holocaust who were rescued and brought to the English Midlands. And quite a number of the stories she tells in that book are about families who were taken in by Christadelphians. And Jason Hensley, the Christadelphian in California, well, he's collected a lot of information and written a book about it called Part of the Family, because they were taken in and really allowed to become part of the family. And now, have we moved on? We're, another 70 years since the end of the war, 75 years. And still people are being persecuted and still risking their lives to get out of places of persecution. Some of them make it and some don't. What's the answer to it all? Well, the answer is the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the needy, shall break in pieces the oppressor. He shall deliver the needy when he crieth, the poor also, and him that hath no helper. He shall spare the poor and the needy, shall save the souls of the needy, redeem their soul from deceit and violence. Precious shall their blood be in his sight. That's what it will be like when Jesus comes. No more persecution, no more violence. Let's pray that it comes soon.